let's go through the texturing process and the step-by-step of how you actually can start texturing after you've finished all your baking and all of that. At least the techniques that I use and how I like to use them. Now, the very first thing I do before I start texturing is actually fix my workspace, because by default, I believe it's very inefficient and there's too much stuff on the screen. First thing I'm going to do is drag my assets to the bottom of the screen. And I'm also going to drag my layers into my texture set list and my texture set settings into my properties list. Now I have less things on the screen at any one time. I have a lot more space, and I never need both of these properties at the same time. Now, let's get started with texturing. First thing I'm going to do is delete this little layer here, and I'm going to create a folder for every segment of the object, or at least every kind of different material type on the object that I'm going to use. I'm also going to label them. So I'm going to start with a wooden hoop, a lever button, and a metal sphere. And all of that is here on our main texture set, which is good. And I'm going to start by giving each of them just a base color so that I can kind of see what's going on with them. And I'm going to do that by simply placing a color, changing the color to something that is going to be the color I want. So I'm going to use a very dark yellow bronze for the bell. And then I'm going to right-click on the group and add a black mask. Then with this black mask, I'm going to either paint on what I want, which is not an efficient way to do it, or click the selection tool and grab the whole object that I want to use. And I'm going to actually just duplicate the layer and place it on the next one, change the color to what I want to use, which is going to be a slightly brighter, kind of pale, leathery color. And again, I'm just going to add a black mask and apply it to the object I want to use. This is actually the button, I believe. And then I'm going to do the same for the very last piece, which is the wooden hoop. And I'm going to use quite a lot of a darker red here for the lever hoop. And like that. We're not going to do anything to the rope yet because that's on a separate texture set. Now I'm going to go through and actually adjust all the properties for them one more time. So for example, this kind of golden, dark looking bell here is blending with everything else quite a lot. So I'm actually going to move it slightly into this direction. And I'm also going to change the other properties, like the roughness, which is how hard or shiny it appears, and whether it's metallic or not. And you're really starting to see how the actual color is affected when you're starting to use metallic. And now we can go something closer to a bronzy color here. The normal and the high information is not something that we're really going to be worrying about at the moment. I'll go through and do that for the rest as well. So lever is technically very rough, at least when it's not being used very much, and it's not metallic at all. And if we go to the stone, that's definitely going to be, oops, that's not the stone. If we go to the wooden hoop, that's definitely going to be 100% rough with no metallic whatsoever, and I'll adjust the color to be a little bit different as well. Now, the thing that we would actually do for a base metal color is not simply apply that. So I'm actually going to turn those off just for a moment and just apply the color. I'm going to right-click on that color and apply a filter. And a filter can do a lot of different things, but one of those things is it can actually make something look more metallic. And down here you have these matte finishes you can apply. I'm going to choose the rough one, and you can see that by default it's just going to chrome everything very badly. So I'm going to turn off roughness, or rather I'm going to turn it on, but I'll go back to my actual color here, and I'm going to actually add an additional control for the roughness and make it do what I want. I'm also going to add the metallic back and make sure that it's 100% metallic, but you can see that what that filter is doing is creating a certain kind of little surface detail which we didn't have before, which makes everything look a little bit more metallic. Now, to actually detail this a little further, which is what I would do after going through and adding the base colors, is I could add another color here. I'm going to turn everything off except the color, make it very dark and red, something like this. It has a very nice shine to it. And then I'm going to add another black mask. Now, on this black mask is on a layer, so it's specifically only going to affect the layer, not the whole group. I can then right-click that black mask, and again, I can add a paint or a fill as I've been using. I can add a filter like I just showed you, and I can add a generator. What a generator does is it uses the maps from your baking, and it uses it to choose where a certain color will appear. For example, I'm going to click the generator and choose curvature, which is going to use the curvature map which we baked during the baking process. A curvature map highlights only the areas where you have sharp or smooth edges, and it can choose to apply the color only in those areas using that map. So now you can see that this very dark red is appearing in this area. Now, I'm not just working from imagination here. I'm really thinking about what kind of material this is. And I actually did some research, which everyone should, about the kinds of colors that actually appear in this kind of material. So we can see a very orange base with some darkening in between the curvature lines. There are some blue kind of happening around these areas where perhaps there's calcium or oxidization or some kind of welding going on. And the very, very shiny areas turn almost yellow, which is quite interesting. Now, going back here, we can see that ours is slightly towards the yellow area. So we're going to turn it a little bit more red and pull it a little bit more towards orange. Then this darker area, we're going to make the color a little bit more similar. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we actually make it slightly more rough. Not too much, but slightly more rough, and definitely keep it only slightly less metallic. And now you're going to see that we have a completely different effect than we did before, purely by having this solid chrome color here. Now we have something that looks quite a bit more bronze than it did initially. And if we want to, we can even lower the opacity of the color just a little bit if we want it to be extra subtle. Now, if we wanted to add more details to this, I would actually just go through one by one and start adding details to every section. But let's focus on the metal just for a little bit longer. And then I'm going to move on to detailing and starting to detail these lower areas as well. So something else that we can do here is we can start painting stuff by hand. So I'm going to add another base layer like this, leave it only as color, and then add a black mask and a paint layer to that. And with this paint layer, I can then go down here to my brushes and choose some kind of brush that I want to paint with. The best kind of brushes for painting realistic stuff are usually actually the artistic one, or going down, it's a brush that is called, if I find it, Dirt Free. This is quite a useful one. And what we can do is we can increase our size a little and really reduce our flow. And then when we start painting in details like erosion or some kind of use, we can start painting them in and also painting them away by pressing X and changing whether we're painting the mask in or painting the mask out. I'm just going to change my flow a little bit more since it is a little bit too weak for my liking. Paint it in, and then you can paint it out. And for some reason, the painting out is being very, very faint, which is slightly annoying. Anyway, as you can see, right now, I'm simply painting a color. But if I go back to the color, and this is the best part, it's non-destructive. I can change the colors anytime, as long as I'm using fill layers and then masks. I can just paint the mask, change the color. So I'm going to change the color to something more suitable to this, and I'm going to make it actually quite a bit darker. And I'm going to change the roughness as well to something quite a lot rougher, and the metallic to something which is actually not very metallic. And now what you're starting to see is kind of wearing marks or kind of splatter marks which are affecting the model here. And it kind of looks like the model is either dirty or has had some kind of weathering occur on top of it. Let me rotate the light so we can see on this side a little better as well. Now you're also starting to notice that it's starting to get a little bit difficult to keep track of the colors on the model. And I'm starting to feel that actually this is a little difficult to texture because I can't see very clearly. And what I can do for this, I can just go back to the colors and adjust the color so that they're a little bit easier to read whilst I'm texturing, and just overall, really. Now we're getting an effect which is a little bit more clear. Let's go back to our color of the thing that we're painting now. Currently it's completely black, with perhaps something a little brighter is going to work a little better. This is red currently. And actually, what color did we have in our render? It was almost kind of a bluish, wasn't it? It's a bluish kind of weathering. You can get something very faint and blue like this. And you can see that this is working a lot better. Now let's go back to those kind of height details that we didn't want to use before. We don't really use the normal here. We only use the height because moving the height up and down actually changes whether what you're painting appears to be indenting the model or not. And now you're starting to see we're getting a very realistic kind of dented meadow look only by just using these very simple, we only have 3 layers here, but we're using them very smartly, and we're starting to get some very interesting surface details on this asset. It's making it look like a very realistic material, and that's for using like these brushes and these generators and just literally messing around with the color, roughness, metallic, and height of our details. The more contrast you create between 2 materials, the more noticeable they're going to be. We have this shiny metal on one side, and we have this rough, non-metallic, brighter dents on the inside, which is essentially just creating a very interesting material to work on. And if we start putting in a bit on the bottom here, make them a little stronger as well if we want to, not necessarily essential. Make them a little bit fainter, in fact. And we can start to add some weathering to this asset as well. If we wanted to, we can even add some discoloration. So actually, before I do that, I just want to show you that this is looking a little bit very choppy if you start zooming in. So I'm going to right-click on the black mask here and add a filter. And I'm going to add a blur filter and just make it very, very faint, slightly faint. Just making those a little bit rounder, a little bit less noticeable. Not necessary at all, but something that you can do depending on what you're working on. And let's just make sure they don't really mess up here. And let's see if we pull the height even further. Nah, I think it's getting too much. But that is something that you can do if you need it. I'm going to leave it off for the moment. And we can add more discoloration. We can do a lot of stuff with this. We can add different generators to make the effect look a little bit better. Personally, I would probably adjust the colors, in fact, to actually be a little less noticeable now. We need them a little noticeable so we can texture a little better. But since I want this to be, it has quite a lot of solid bronze going on around it, we probably don't want them to be too strong. And I will adjust the actual coloration here as well to be slightly less noticeable as well, and things like that. So that's one way you can work on a metal object. Now, going down here and working on these objects, what I usually do for non-metal object, so let's start with the lever button, for example. I'll have a base color, and then I'll duplicate that base color, excuse me, and I'll turn everything off except the color and darken it just a little bit. And then I'm going to right-click that, add a black mask, add a generator, and add a curvature generator. And that's going to put that slightly darkened area in between the kind of curves of that model and allow me to really see the details a little bit better. And then I'm actually going to reduce the opacity of that quite a lot, just so I have this faint starting point that's a lot easier to see. Something that I'll probably add to the entire model overall is a fill layer that I'm just going to add color for the moment, make it black, add a black mask, add a generator, and use ambient occlusion, which I've already explained several times how it works. It only covers the very dark, close together areas of the model like this. So I can make sure that that covers the model quite well. And now again, even though it's very subtle, I can even like reduce the intensity a little bit, but it creates a little bit of a starting point for the rest of the materials. The texture lever, I would just research lever, and a good thing to look at lever is a lever wallet, and actually lever patina, which is the darkening of lever over time. And it's really useful to see how lever originally can be very like bright and yellow, and over time becomes darker and shinier. And that's just simply something that I would apply to the model by hand to make that material show up using the dirt brush. And the stone, again, I would just go through creating curvature and painting by hand and continuing on. Now, instead of going through all of these, which I will do at a later date, and I'll start sharing different tutorials that have been made for texturing different kinds of materials, because there's a lot of content out there. I'll share with you tutorials I've made in the past and make some as well in the future. But for now, I'm just gonna open up actually a version that I have already got going here. Additionally, I would like to say that you yourself need to be researching the ways to make these materials in Substance Painter yourself, because you're only yourself going to know what kind of materials you need to be working on and how they need to be made, etc. And that's a very good way to study the tool yourself. Now, as you can see, this is made up of quite a lot of materials, and this is quite a complex thing. The first thing I'm going to show you is the sphere, and just show you that it's pretty much exactly the same as before. We have our metal bases, and then we have a lot of colors. They're filling it in different ways in creating different kind of effects. You can see that here I have like this kind of edge wear around the edges in the center that makes it look like it's welded together, and et cetera, et cetera. But it is nothing different from what I've shown you already. Simply the colors are different. If I go down here to the button base, you're going to see that, again, similar to what I've shown you, there's only 3 layers here. I have a base layer, which is just the base color of the asset. And after that, I have a slightly lighter layer, which is using the curvature map. And after that, I have an ambient occlusion, which is creating that darkening on the top there. And everything except the actual curvature, or rather just to say the ambient occlusion, I could have simply painted in by hand. But it's a very simple material. And if I click each one, you can see my base material just has everything set. It's just a little bit rough. The material after that, that's this highlighting curvature material, is very rough. So it's creating a contrast in the light, which is important. And the darker material that's right at the top is, again, the same kind of roughness, again, creating a contrast of shininess from the bottom to the top. And from a distance, when you don't think about how simple it is and all of that, it just fits very well with everything else. Now let's look at this kind of stony wooden asset here, which perhaps I think needs to be more well defined so we know whether it's stone or wood. Let's take a look at that. And this hoop is essentially, again, made up of a simple base color, a curvature, which highlights the edges as such. Then we have the ambient occlusion, which makes the top quite a lot brighter. And lastly, we have a grunge layer on top of everything, which makes everything kind of slightly dirtier looking. And to be fair, I genuinely think this is the weakest part of the material, because it's not very clear what it is, even if it does fit in with the rest of the stuff somewhat. But it's a very straightforward material. Again, needs some more research, I believe. Actually, it looks a little bit cardboard, to be honest. The rope is very simple, although it looks quite complex as well. If I take everything off, the rope is very simply a solid color, and then by hand, I painted these strips, and I did that in the 2D viewport. I just painted them by hand. And then I did sorry, I went into non-speaking mode there for a second. It's been quite a while of talking. Afterwards, I applied a repeatable material for rope and just made sure it goes in this direction and on the 2D viewport, and you can see that it has gone over the rope. And then I just faded, actually, this is an ambient occlusion, darkens it, makes it look more realistic. And then I faded the edges as such. And I can show people how to create, and me and any of the associate lecturers can help you find ways for texturing the various different kinds of materials which your assets are gonna have. But what I want to show you with this is that as long as you know what end result you want, whether you do it through researching and looking at the materials or you have it in your mind, you're able to do it with Substance Painter simply by using the tools available to you. And if there's something you want to achieve but you do not know how to achieve, You simply need to talk to us, and we'll explain to you how you can use the tools to achieve those ends. So I hope this was useful, and the next session is simply going to cover how to approach stylized texturing, which is a similar process but has just some minor differences. Thanks for watching.